Hey everyone. For years after Whitney Houston's passing, people close to her carried fragments of conversations that never quite fit into interviews or tributes, words that felt too heavy, too complicated, and too honest for a world that preferred to remember her only through flawless vocals and iconic moments. And when BeBe Winans finally began speaking more openly about what Whitney once warned him about, it wasn't delivered as a shocking accusation or a dramatic exposé, but as a sobering reflection from someone who had witnessed both the beauty and the contradictions inside the gospel and music worlds. Because Whitney's relationship with gospel music was never casual or performative. It was foundational, deeply personal, and tied to her sense of identity long before fame complicated everything. And according to BeBe, Whitney often spoke privately about how gospel spaces, despite their spiritual language, were not immune to ego, politics, exploitation, or judgment, especially when money, influence, and public image entered the picture. And her warning wasn't directed at faith itself, but at the people who sometimes used faith as a shield while operating with the same ambition and competitiveness found in secular industries. And BeBe described how Whitney, having moved fluidly between gospel roots and global superstardom, saw firsthand how some artists were celebrated publicly while being scrutinized or condemned privately, how grace was preached but not always practiced, and how expectations placed on gospel singers could become suffocating, especially when they didn't fit a narrow image of purity or perfection. And what made Whitney's warning so haunting in retrospect is that it came from someone who had experienced both unconditional love and harsh judgment from religious communities, sometimes from the very people who praised her talent the loudest. And BeBe suggested that Whitney was painfully aware of how quickly admiration could turn into moral surveillance, how artists could be spiritually elevated in public, yet emotionally isolated behind closed doors, and how the pressure to represent holiness could strip away space for honesty, struggle, and healing. And these conversations, shared quietly between friends rather than broadcast to the world, revealed Whitney's fear that young gospel artists entering the industry were being unprepared for the realities they would face, not just the temptations of fame, but the silence that follows when vulnerability is met with condemnation instead of compassion. And BeBe emphasized that Whitney wasn't bitter, she was protective, especially of artists who believed that gospel spaces were automatically safer, kinder, or more forgiving than secular ones. And she wanted them to understand that spirituality does not cancel human flaws, and that discernment is just as necessary among believers as it is anywhere else. And after her death, those warnings took on a heavier meaning because people began to reassess how often Whitney's pain had been spiritualized, minimized, or ignored under the guise of prayer instead of being met with real support. And BeBe's decision to finally speak about these conversations wasn't about blaming gospel artists or attacking the church, but about honoring Whitney's truth in a way that felt overdue, acknowledging that her struggles didn't make her less faithful, and that her insight didn't disappear just because it made people uncomfortable. And as listeners absorb this story now, what resonates most is not scandal, but recognition, the realization that even spaces built on faith can fail the people within them if honesty is discouraged and image is prioritized over empathy. And Whitney's warning, as relayed by BeBe Winans, stands as a quiet but powerful reminder that spirituality without compassion becomes performance, that talent without care becomes extraction, and that artists, no matter how gifted or anointed, are still human beings who need grace more than scrutiny. And in the end, what BeBe exposed was not a secret, but a truth many sensed and few dared to say out loud, that Whitney Houston, long before she was gone, saw the cracks in the systems around her and tried, in her own way, to warn others before they learned the same lessons through pain. Thanks for watching.